This move initiates the English opening, a flexible and strategic choice that controls the center from the flank and prepares to develop pieces to advantageous squares. This move, developing the knight to f6, is a flexible response to 1. c4, often leading to the king's Indian defense or other hypermodern systems where black aims to control the center with pieces before committing pawn advances. This move signals white's intention to enter a king's Indian attack or a related flexible English opening setup, preparing for a kingside pawn storm or central expansion. This move signals a transition into a queen's Indian or Nimzo Indian setup, preparing to develop the kingside pieces and control the d5 square. This move stakes a central pawn claim, preparing to develop the king's bishop and control key squares, often leading to variations of the English opening or symmetrical variations if black challenges the center. This move enters the symmetrical English, aiming to control the d4 square and challenge white's central pawn majority by creating an unbalanced pawn structure. This move, 4. e5, aggressively challenges black's knight and aims to gain space in the center, potentially leading to a Maroshi bind formation if white follows up with d4. This move, ing8, is a highly unusual retreat that abandons central control and the development of piece activity, suggesting black is either seeking a highly defensive posture or has a specific, unusual plan in mind that deviates significantly from standard opening principles. This move asserts central control and opens lines for white's pieces, aiming to exploit black's slightly passive knight retreat and prepare for further queenside or kingside development. This captures the central pawn, opening the c-file and creating an unbalanced pawn structure that can lead to dynamic play. This move centralizes the queen aggressively and prepares for further development, aiming to exploit black's slightly passive knight retreat. This move develops a piece and contests the center, preparing to challenge white's central pawn majority and potentially open lines for piece activity. The queen repositions to e4, maintaining pressure on the d4 pawn and preparing to support a central pawn advance, while also keeping an eye on kingside development. This move prepares to contest the center with the d-pawn and opens lines for the bishop, aiming to counter white's central space advantage. Developing the knight to f3 reinforces the e5 pawn and prepares for kingside castling, a standard developing move in many English opening structures. This move opens the d-file and frees black's dark-squared bishop, creating dynamic counterplay after white's aggressive pawn push. This knight recapture opens lines for white's pieces and challenges black's central control, forcing a decision regarding pawn structure and piece development. This move, 9. nf6, challenges white's knight on e5 and develops black's knight, aiming to disrupt white's central control and potentially prepare for castling. This move, nxc6, aims to disrupt black's pawn structure by doubling their pawns on the c-file, creating weaknesses that white can target later in the game. This move attacks the c3 knight, forcing it to move and disrupting white's central control, while also preparing to develop the queenside pieces. This move repositions the queen to a safer square, anticipating the threat of the knight on c6 and preparing to support a central pawn push. This pawn capture opens the b-file for the rook, creating active play and potential counterplay against white's queenside pawn structure. This move develops the bishop to an active square, preparing to castle kingside and connect the rooks while unblocking the d-file for future piece activity. Developing the bishop to b7 immediately pressures white's center and prepares to contest the d4 square. Castling kingside secures the monarch and prepares to connect the rooks, a standard development step after central pawn exchanges in piece development. This move aggressively challenges white's central pawn and aims to disrupt white's development by forcing a response on the queenside. The queen repositions to h3, indirectly defending the c3 knight and preparing to potentially bring it back into the game if needed, while also keeping an eye on the kingside. Developing the bishop to a natural square aims to complete kingside castling, connect the rooks, and prepare for future pawn breaks in the center. This move develops the bishop to an active diagonal, preparing to castle and connect the rooks while putting pressure on black's queenside pawns. Black continues their development and secures their king by castling, a fundamental step in most openings to achieve king safety and prepare for active piece play. This move prepares to activate the queenside bishop by allowing it to develop to b2, supporting the central pawn structure and potentially eyeing the long diagonal. This move strategically places the rook on an open file, preparing to contest it with white's queen and potentially create pressure along the d-file as black aims to develop their pieces more actively. This move develops the bishop, bringing it to a more active square where it eyes the d6 pawn and supports the kingside attack, aiming to pressure black's queenside pawn structure. This move develops the bishop to an active square, eyeing the d5 pawn and preparing to contest the important central squares. This move initiates a plan to reposition the knight to c5, aiming to control key central squares and potentially disrupt black's queenside pawn structure. The queen repositions to c7, preparing to challenge the white queen's influence on the c-file and potentially supporting a future advance of the b-pawn or freeing the rook on d8. This exchange simplifies the position by trading off a potentially problematic piece for white, eliminating black's active bishop and gaining control of the c-file for future pressure. Black recaptures the bishop, solidifying the pawn structure and preparing to contest the open c-file. Rad1 aims to control the open d-file, a crucial strategic objective that will allow white to exert pressure on black's queenside pawns, and potentially exploit weaknesses if black fails to adequately defend. This move, Rak8, prepares to contest the central open c-file, aiming to challenge white's control and potentially create counterplay for black's pieces. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, potentially preparing to attack the c5 pawn or support a pawn push on the queenside, while also keeping an eye on the kingside. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square where it controls key central squares and supports potential advances on the queenside. White is preparing to activate the rook on h1 by clearing the g1 square, potentially aiming for a kingside attack or a repositioning to the center via g3. The bishop retreats to a more passive square, relinquishing the active diagonal and creating a potential weakness on the dark squares should white's queen or knight later penetrate. This move aims to fortify the kingside pawn structure, preventing black's bishop from potentially infiltrating on g4 and creating a more robust defensive setup before considering further attacking or maneuvering plans. This move prepares to connect the rooks and activate the king to a more central and potentially safer square, anticipating further pawn structure changes or tactical skirmishes on the kingside. The queen repositions to f2, potentially preparing to support a kingside advance or to meet black's developing counterplay on the queenside by reinforcing the e3 bishop. The rook exchange simplifies the position, removes a black defender from the 7th rank, and potentially opens the d-file for white's remaining rook if it captures back. The rook transfer to the open d-file is a standard strategic maneuver. reinforcing control over a key central file and preparing to contest its occupancy with black's remaining rook. Black re-centers the queen to a more active square, aiming to contest the open d file and prepare for potential piece exchanges. The queen repositions to g3, aiming to potentially unbalance the position and create tactical opportunities on the kingside, possibly preparing for a kingside pawn advance or a re-evaluation of white's attacking prospects. This move simplifies the position by exchanging queens, which can be beneficial when facing a more active opponent, aiming to enter an endgame where material and pawn structure become more critical. This pawn capture on g3 is a structural concession, creating doubled pawns for white, but it opens the h-file for potential future activity and prepares to reinforce the central pawn chain. This pawn move aims to create space on the kingside and potentially prepare for a future pawn storm, while also preventing white's knight from easily accessing the g4 square. This move prepares to activate the king, which is often a central goal in endgames and simplified middle games, looking to support the pawns and potentially participate in attacking maneuvers. The black king now steps off the vulnerable d-file and seeks a safer central post, preparing to support the queenside pawns and potentially join the fight on the kingside later. This move repositions the king to a more active central square, preparing to support the d-pawn and potentially control open files as the endgame materializes. This move develops the king towards the center, aiming to activate it in the endgame and potentially support pawn advances. This knight maneuver aims to reroute to a more active square, potentially controlling central squares or supporting pawn advances. This move aims to create space on the queenside and prepare for a potential advance of the a-pawn, which could disrupt white's pawn structure and gain queenside space. White repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to control the central squares and potentially attack on the queenside after black's king moves further from the center. This move repositions the rook to the c-file, preparing to challenge white's control of that open file and potentially create counterplay against white's kingside structure. The rook move to h1 prepares to challenge the open h-file, potentially creating attacking opportunities against black's kingside or supporting a central pawn advance. The bishop repositions to d6, eyeing the d4 square and potentially supporting a future e5 pawn break or transferring to the kingside if the central tension resolves. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, allowing it to potentially influence the kingside and support a kingside pawn advance, while also keeping an eye on the weakened squares on the queenside. The knight repositions to d7, a common maneuver in many English opening structures aiming to support a potential e5 advance or defend against white's pressure on the queenside and central pawn advances. This pawn thrust creates dynamic imbalances, aiming to break open lines for your rook and potentially attack black's kingside while weakening your own king's position. Capturing the pawn on g4 opens the h-file for the rook, potentially creating attacking chances against white's king if followed up aggressively. This check forces black's king into a more exposed position, potentially leading to tactical opportunities for white on the open king's file and king's diagonal. The king must centralize to participate in the endgame and avoid checkmate threats on the back rank. This pawn capture on g4 is a crucial moment, opening the f-file for your rook and activating it with check, forcing the opposing king to move and disrupting its defensive structure. The pawn push to g5 is a strategic decision to prevent white's knight from reaching the active f4 square, while also creating a safe haven for the king on g7. The bishop repositions to e3, aiming to reinforce the kingside and potentially support a kingside pawn advance after the exchange of queens, while also keeping an eye on the d4 square. This move is a reaction to white's g-pawn push, aiming to create a pawn chain and defend the king while opening lines for the rook on the f-file. The knight repositions to c3, aiming to control central squares and prepare for a potential advance of the a-pawn or support a central pawn push after developing this piece. The king seeks safety on the edge of the board, but the open files and pawn structure on the queenside present ongoing risks that must be managed. This move forces the black king to move, opening up tactical possibilities for white's rook and potentially creating weaknesses around the black king. The king retreats to the center after the check, aiming to consolidate and prepare for the next phase of the endgame, potentially seeking refuge on the f-file or seeking active play once the pawn structure stabilizes. The knight repositions to e4, controlling the key d6 and f6 squares and preparing to potentially attack the kingside pawn structure or reinforce the kingside defense. The bishop retreats to a more secure square, anticipating white's potential knight maneuvers and aiming to maintain its influence on the kingside diagonal. The rook aggressively attacks the knight on e7, forcing its retreat and aiming to exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure. The king seeks refuge and activates on the kingside, aiming to connect with the remaining pieces and potentially support a pawn advance. This move is a check that forces the black king to move again, maintaining pressure and preventing any immediate respite or consolidation for black. This move continues the king's slow repositioning towards the center, which is a common strategy in endgames to activate the king and support pawn play, while the white king is also centralizing to contest this. This check forces the black king to move again, allowing white to potentially improve the rook's position and control the 7th rank. The king cautiously repositions, avoiding the perpetual check along the h-file and seeking a safer haven from white's active rook. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, preparing to defend the king and potentially support pawn advances in the center and kingside. This move repositions the knight to a potentially more active square, aiming to challenge white's control of the center and prepare for a defensive setup or a later kingside advance. The rook, having completed its maneuver to the kingside, now occupies the h1 square, preparing to support the pawn advance on the kingside or potentially swing to the f-file if opportunities arise. This move, 4-5, kilogram 6, is a critical decision for black's king as it seeks safety and potential activity. But it must be carefully managed to avoid becoming a target for white's active pieces. The rook's relocation to the d-file aims to increase pressure on the d-pawn and potentially activate the rook for future offensive operations, especially if the position opens further. This move aims to aggressively disrupt white's king safety and potentially create attacking chances by opening lines, forcing white to react to threats against their king. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, eyeing potential breakthroughs or defense on the kingside as black's pieces cluster. The bishop retreats to d6 to maintain its defensive post and prepare for potential pawn advances or to support the knight on f8. This move activates the bishop from its passive square, preparing to potentially challenge black's pawns on the kingside or support a central pawn advance. In the future, this move repositions the knight to a more active central square, potentially preparing to attack white's advanced pawn on e5 or support a pawn push on the kingside. This pawn capture on f5 opens the g-file for the rook and forces the black king to a more exposed position. a key strategic goal in this endgame scenario. This move opens the e-file, allowing the black king more breathing room and potentially creating opportunities for counterplay. On the king side, as white's knight on d2 is now under pressure. This pawn thrust aims to open lines for your rooks and create play on the king side, though it also weakens the pawn chain and could invite counterplay if black can establish a strong pawn presence in the center. The move 50, nb6 aims to redeploy the knight to a more active square, potentially targeting white's weak pawn on c4 or supporting a kingside pawn advance with f4. The move 51, kf3 aims to centralize the king, preparing it to support the g-pawn's advance or to participate in potential endgame operations. While avoiding checks, the bishop retreats to a more active diagonal, aiming to control key squares and potentially support pawn advances in the center. This move aims to disrupt black's coordination by targeting the knight on b6, potentially creating imbalances and forcing concessions as black defends. The move 52, rf6 repositions the rook to a more active file, aiming to create threats on the king side and potentially support a pawn advance or coordinate with the knight on d7. The move kg2 is a prudent regrouping, seeking to safeguard the king from potential counterplay on the h-file while also preparing to potentially activate the king on the queen side. This pawn capture opens the f-file, which can be utilized by black's rooks to create attacking chances on the king side, potentially targeting white's king. This move exchanges the knight for a pawn, simplifying the position and creating a passed pawn on the g-file for white, which can become a significant strategic asset. This move seeks to activate the rook on the third rank, aiming to challenge white's control of the central files and potentially create counterplay against white's king or supporting pieces. This move repositions the king to a more active central square, preparing to support the pawn majority on the king side and potentially join the fight for the central files once the queens are exchanged. The bishop repositions to f6, seeking to activate itself on the central dark squares and support potential pawn advances, while also defending the d6 square. This exchange simplifies the position, removing a key defender of the black kingside and forcing black to recapture, which will allow white's g-pawn to become a dangerous passed pawn. This move is a decisive tactical blow, a discovered check from the rook that forces the king out of its defensive shell and immediately leads to a decisive material advantage for white due to the ensuing pawn capture. The king must now find a safe haven, as white's king has become surprisingly active, threatening to exploit black's exposed monarch. The knight repositions to c8, potentially preparing to redeploy to e7 to reinforce the kingside or to b6 to contest the queenside pawns and outposts. This move repositions the bishop to an active square, supporting the knight's advance and preparing to challenge black's remaining pawns. This aggressive check by the rook aims to dislodge the white king from its central post, potentially leading to tactical complications or a better endgame if white's king is forced into an exposed position. The king's defensive pawn structure has been significantly weakened, making the white king's advance a strategic necessity to exploit the open diagonals and support the passed pawn. This move is a critical defensive maneuver to prevent white's knight from activating further on the c8 square and to prepare for potential king activity or counterplay on the queenside by contesting the open files and diagonals with the rook. This move aims to create a passed pawn on the queenside, which can become a dangerous threat if black cannot effectively blockade or capture it. The king is still vulnerable and must find safety. and bringing the king to the center of the board is often a necessary part of the endgame, even if it seems counterintuitive. This move repositions the rook to the third rank, where it can potentially support a pawn push or control open files, while also preparing for further maneuvering or defense. The move re5 is aimed at activating the rook, preparing to contest the d file or potentially swing over to the king side to support the pawn push on g4, while also offering some defense for the f7 pawn. The move 62 kg4 is a logical repositioning of the king to escape the immediate threats on the kingside and prepare for defensive maneuvers in the center and on the queenside. The move aims to consolidate the kingside defense and prepare for potential counterplay on the queenside, acknowledging the pawn weakness on g4. This move aims to restrict black's pieces, particularly the knight, by creating a more dynamic pawn structure and preparing to activate the rook on the a file. This check forces the white king to a vulnerable square, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially create winning opportunities in the endgame. The white king now centralizes, aiming to join the action and support potential pawn advances while contesting the important central squares. This forcing check, while temporarily gaining a tempo, allows white's king to safely reach the favorable a5 square, consolidating its position and preparing to advance its queenside pawns. This move seeks to centralize the king, a crucial step in many endgames, and prepare for potential pawn pushes on the queenside or kingside while defending the e3 square. This move aims to reposition the rook to a more active file, potentially supporting a kingside pawn advance or creating threats along the open file. The rook repositions to a more active file, aiming to exert pressure on black's kingside and potentially create mating threats should the opposing king be forced into an exposed position. The king's march to safety is halted as the checking rook forces a crucial king move, aiming to prevent further pawn advances and consolidate material. This move relocates the king to a safer square, centralizing it to potentially support the remaining pawns and prepare for endgame maneuvers. This move captures a pawn, but abandons the defense of the d4 pawn, potentially creating weaknesses on the queenside in return for material gain. This rook check is a tactical opportunity to simplify the position and exploit black's disconnected pawns, leading to a favorable endgame where white's connected passed pawns on the queenside can become a decisive advantage. This move captures the pawn on c4, but it does not significantly alter the material balance and leaves black's king somewhat exposed on the queenside after white recaptures with the rook. This check forces black's king to move and allows white to regain the pawn on c6, simplifying the position and creating winning chances with the extra material. The king is exposed on f5 after the rook check, leaving it vulnerable to immediate threats from white's queen and rook, which could lead to significant material loss or even checkmate. This endgame has simplified significantly, and white's tactical calculation to win a pawn with rx-a6 is sound, forcing black to concede material to prevent further losses. The pawn on g4 is now supported and creates an advanced outpost, aiming to restrict white's knight and potentially open lines for the rook later. This king check forces black's king to a more exposed square, allowing white to activate their rook aggressively and target the weak g-pawn or continue the mating attack. 71. k4 is a critical move, aiming to activate the king and support the pawn advance, but it must be carefully considered against white's active pieces and threats on the kingside. The bishop advances to c7, aiming to control the crucial light squares and prevent black's knight from easily repositioning to d5. while also preparing to support a potential pawn advance on the kingside. This move is a tactical desperation, aiming to exploit the temporarily undefended white king by forcing a check and hoping for a miraculous recovery by creating counterplay with the rook and passed pawn. The king must actively participate in the endgame, and moving to c3 prepares to support the queenside pawns and contest the open files. This move activates the rook to a more central file, supporting the pawn advance and preparing to contest control of the 7th rank. This move aims to reposition the bishop to a more active square on h2, where it can potentially support a kingside attack or defend against any immediate threats while maintaining control of the long diagonal. This move aims to maintain the pawn threat on the h-file, preventing white from consolidating their queenside advantage and creating further pawn play. This move aims to control the a-file and restrict black's king's movement, preparing for potential pawn advances on the queenside. With the pawn on b8 now a significant weakness, black's king must actively participate in defending it to prevent white from establishing an unstoppable passed pawn. This move activates the bishop to a more dynamic diagonal, preparing to support the kingside pawn advance or potentially swing over to attack black's queenside if the opportunity arises. This move is a significant defensive maneuver, aiming to block the advancing white rook and prevent it from reaching the critical 7th rank, which would greatly enhance white's attacking potential. This check forces the king to move, creating an opportunity to exploit the weakened pawn structure and potentially win material or create a decisive passed pawn. The move attempts to disrupt white's king safety and potentially create counterplay, but it overlooks the strong discovered attack white has on the rook after the next move. This move reactivates the rook, preparing to contest the important 7th rank and support the advance of the g-pawn, while simultaneously creating a battery on the f-file should black's king remain exposed. The knight repositions to the e7 feet square, preparing to join the defensive effort on the kingside and potentially support pawn advances or counterplay in the center once the immediate threats are addressed. This move aims to advance the passed pawn, creating a dangerous threat that forces black to react, potentially leading to pawn weaknesses or piece exchanges in black's position.